Hello and welcome back to this damn full idealistic crusade. In this video, I'd like to talk about all the books I read for the June on the Range reading event, which has taken place over the month of June and is another of the wonderful booktube reading events that I usually get to see everybody post about and don't often find the time to squeeze in. There are so many wonderful reading events, it's hard to choose just one, and this, of course, is not the only reading event that happened over June, but this is the one I wanted to try. And it was started by, of course, Michael K. Vaughan, whose channel is one of my absolute favorites on YouTube. So if you haven't seen his incredible booktube channel, definitely go and check it out. But this year, there were a couple rules in addition to just reading Westerns. So those three rules for the whole event were to read something by Zane Grey, to read something by Louis L'Amour, and then to read at least two other Western books. Now, personally, I've not actually read a lot of Westerns in the past. I'm, of course, a giant fan of the Western film genre and its history, but I had never actually translated that love and fascination into literature. It was only a couple years ago that I read my first real Western novel, and so ever since then I've been trying different sorts of things and also trying to read some of the foundational works. So this event actually inspired me to finally sit down and read both Zane Grey and Louis L'Amour, who are basically the two giant names in Western literature, along with Max Brand and Owen Wister and a handful of others. So I thought I could easily read 4 books over June and talk about the 4 Westerns that I read. But I actually wound up doing a lot more than that. Even though I've had very little time, I managed to squeeze in a lot more than 4 Westerns. So these are the Westerns I will be discussing in this video, and you can see my Kobo e-reader on the top as I also read some digital books. So what I'll do in this video is briefly talk about all of these and give you the sort of experience I had for this year's June on the Range. So to start, I finally sat down and read one of the most famous landmark Westerns of all time, which is, of course, Zane Grey's Riders of the Purple Sage from 1912. This is the pocketbooks edition, I believe, from the 1980s, and I had picked this up and I've been meaning to read it for way too long. It's got a really nice wraparound cover, and you can see the purple sage is reflected by actually having the glossy cover with a sort of purple tinge across the top. Now, of course, being 1912, this book is in the public domain, so you can actually read it for free. I'll include a link to the Standard Books ebook edition, which is wonderful, so you can enjoy one of the foundational Westerns for yourself. This is a very good story filled with classical Western elements. You'll recognize all the story tropes, everything from the woman leader of a ranch who's having to deal with forces that are trying to control her life and destiny, the mysterious gunman figure who rides in from the plains and has a past that is not immediately clear, but there are ties to certain past events that have happened in the area. And then you've got your various villainous factions. You've got the secret gang of cattle rustlers that are moving in and out of the Purple Sage, and then the local controlling interest of the town, which is basically a group of Mormons who want to control Jane Witherstein and basically have her marry into their Mormon dynasty, and she's too much set in her own ways, and she has too much spirit and independence, so she's been resisting them, and that's where the book actually opens, is with a confrontation between her and the Mormons in town. The fact that some of the villains are Mormon characters means that this has a particular outlook that was common or popped up in literature at this time. It is, of course, set in Utah, and immediately makes me think of the really the sort of Western backstory of A Study in Scarlet. So when Conan Doyle wrote the first Sherlock Holmes story, and you get to the flashback section where you find out the reasons why the murders and crimes have been actually committed, and you find out that it's a story of revenge that has taken years to accomplish. Well, in that story, Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson find out that the real villains of the piece are the Mormons in town out west that set all this stuff in motion and caused all this pain and misery. So it very much fits in with some of the themes that you're getting in Riders of the Purple Sage. Now, this being a book from 1912 means that the writing style and the pacing and the plotting, it's not going to be the easiest for modern audiences to jump into, but I think you will get that with any extremely popular literature of this time period. I will say that the opening is rather slow going. You can recognize the plot that's starting to emerge, but the storytelling and wording and plotting, it's a bit heavy on the melodrama. It's a bit heavy on the descriptions of the location, but I do think it starts to pick up, and I would say that if the opening feels a little sluggish or if it's a little slow for you, just stick with it. This is one of the foundational works in terms of Westerns. It was immensely popular in 1912. It's been reprinted and adapted time and time again, and a lot of the story elements you would recognize as cliches of the Western today. So it becomes immediately familiar, and in some ways it does feel a little bit similar to when you read Tarzan of the Apes for the first time and you get the Tarzan story in its original pure form. Plus, this book, like Tarzan, does set up an immediate sequel, and the sequel to this book is The Rainbow Trail, which I think came out a year or two later, or maybe I think it was 1915, so I am interested to check that out. But this is a classic read that I think everybody has to approach at some point if you're going to get into Westerns. I've always heard of it. I knew the title. I knew this was Zane Grey's most famous work and the one that established him as the giant among Western writers early on, and so his influence is massive. But now I'm glad I've finally read it, and I can understand why this was so popular back in 1912. And again, what's great is that it's in the public domain, so you can read it for free. The Louis L'Amour book that I read is Guns of the Timberlands from 1955 originally. It had been published previously in a magazine, so I assume that was a shorter version, and then it was translated and slightly expanded into novel form. So this has, of course, seen a million different reprints. There's a bunch of different cover artworks and designs. This, I think, is really nice and striking for the artwork of this Bantam paperback reissue. This was the earliest L'Amour book that I actually had a copy of. You see Louis L'Amour books everywhere, and so I've picked up a few when I've found them for cheap, and so I decided I would start and read my first L'Amour book, and so I just chose the earliest one that I had, which is this one. So again, this came out in 1955, and it's a very straightforward story. It's about a rancher named Clay Bell who has basically eked out a living trying to raise cattle until one day a wealthy businessman comes into town with a notion of taming the land for himself, and of course this will mean needing or disrupting the land that Clay Bell currently runs on, and it leads eventually to a final showdown between the two. But it's instant antagonism. Bell refuses to give in, and it becomes a battle of wills between the two, with the beautiful fiancée of the wealthy businessman industrialist caught between the two, and she and Bell have an immediate connection. So from what I've read and what I've seen, this book is evocative of everything that you expect from a L'Amour novel. It's got beautiful description of the terrain, of the little moments between the set pieces or bursts of action. It's got a very realistic and lived-in quality to it, and it's also at its heart a romance, because there is the connection between the characters. It's a love triangle that then gets fractured, and you hope while reading the book that the right characters will end up with each other. As a reading experience, though, I have to say I found this quite difficult. It was a bit of a slog, admittedly. I think it's well written. I think the descriptions and the atmosphere is wonderful, but the actual plot is not very complicated, and you know where it's going when you start the book, and it seems like you just have to go through a lot of different smaller incidents that don't add up to a whole lot. It's like everything that happens in most of the book is pushing the characters closer to the final confrontation. And there's also this theme that emerges that Clay Bell is a lot more dangerous than he seems, and he may have done a lot of crazier or darker things in his past that he's tried to bury down. And so if that comes to the surface, will he be able to essentially hold on to the life that he has built for himself? So it adds another layer of danger and tension, which is great. But I just felt reading this that most of the book very much meandered. That's why I think it was so difficult for me to get through. Again, I don't think it's a bad book, and I am curious to try other Lamore works. Maybe one of his better regarded or later works might read a little bit better. But I just found this a bit difficult to get through, just because the pacing was rather slow and the story was very simple. But the characters were nicely fleshed out. The characterizations were quite interesting, and I do think the conclusion was good and very fitting. I just wish there was less of a sense of the book meandering so much. Now for everything else, I'd like to start with actually a Western pulp magazine reprint. I managed to get another of the really fantastic Adventure House reprints of the sadly short-lived Lone Ranger pulp magazine. So this was done in the late 1930s at the height of the popularity of the iconic radio series, which is one of the masterpieces of the golden age of radio. So in the pulp, you get a fantastic pulpy cover. This is the issue from May of 1937, I believe it was. And then what you get here in this magazine is a feature story with the Lone Ranger and Tonto. Not a particularly long story, but it's longer than the shorter backups as you would get in a pulp magazine. And the tone of the stories in the magazine are a little bit darker, a little bit grittier than what you get in the radio show. So in the pulp stories, there's usually a little bit more violence. There's usually a couple of deaths as well that probably would have happened off screen in the radio series, or the level of violence would have been dialed down due to censorship of the time and the radio series having such a large audience of kids. So the pulp version is basically giving you stories that they could have done on the radio series. Everything's in keeping with the classic radio characters, but the pulp magazine stories are a little bit darker. This is a full replica, so you've got the original dual column format and the really lovely black and white artwork scattered throughout for the Lone Ranger novel, The Masked Rider's Justice. Again, these are absolutely wonderful, and the reason why you will want to pick up and read some of these magazine issues if you're a big fan of the Lone Ranger. Now, this is the third issue of the magazine I've read. Unfortunately, it only lasted for a couple issues, but I think this is one of the more satisfying of the stories, as in this reprint, it ends at page 66, so it is satisfying, and you can see how this is basically just like I guess more of a PG-13 rated version of a story that could have been told in the iconic radio show. And then the rest of the magazine is a variety of backup stories. They're actually an odd mix, though, because they're not just Western fiction stories. They're actually a mixture of nature stories and also life on the frontier stories and histories of great battles and different things, but you also have to look at them for being written in the 1930s. So for example, the stories of great battles is very much one-sided and is not going to get into the details of these supposed great battles not always having been, shall we say, great. They are basically using the accepted versions of history at that time. So these are very much a time capsule. So you've got a story about Texas gunfighters. You've got another in a series entitled Life on the Ranch, which is literally about ranch life and cow herding and roping and so on and so forth. I think the most successful of the other stories in these are the actual fiction stories. So you do get some depending on the magazine. So here, you've got a wonderful one with lovely art entitled Dust Devils. These magazines were still at least keeping kids in mind because they usually included some form of a goofy little comic as well. And then you get the return of the Chuck Wagon chats, which is basically the letters column as if it was being answered by the head cook of the wagon train. Then there's another fun fiction story called The 3-in-1 Lawman. Then we have famous frontier fights, and again, these historical accounts, you do have to keep in mind that they are just going to be repeating the accepted version of history at the time. Then another final short story, The Marshal of Frozen Cat. And then nicely, you've got all the vintage ads and inducements to get the next issue next month. Again, this is the Adventure House reprint, and you can actually get all the issues in this same form that's really nicely done and includes all of the original images, artwork, and advertisements. So I do highly recommend these, especially if you're a Lone Ranger fan, but the actual contents of the magazines vary from issue to issue, and I think this is maybe the best I've read so far because it has more fiction stories, and the Lone Ranger story was a bit more gripping and a little bit longer than some of the others. So the appeal is definitely there for Lone Ranger fans, but it also gives you the flavor of what a Western pulp magazine was like. Then I read a book in the Stagecoach series. This is from Bantam. This is Stagecoach Station 39, so the title of this book is Fort Verde. The concept of this was basically that every book in this series would be somehow tied to a stagecoach line, and then each book wasn't just numbered, it was given the designation of station, then the number in the series, and you would have the stagecoach line be involved somehow, and this apparently spun out of the success that Bantam had with the Wagons West series, which is why they use that prominently in the promotion. The artwork is very good, and as you can see, it indicates that this is going to be a cavalry story. And so this is actually a rather entertaining and engaging book. You have a young Army officer being sent out west for the first time and going to a fort where the commander has a lower rank and has become an alcoholic, as he was one of the first to see the aftermath of Custer's last stand, and that, along with never being allowed to rise in the ranks in the army, has made him become an alcoholic shell of his former self. You've got a wonderful cast of characters in and around the fort and the nearby town. You've got the relations that are still ongoing with certain Native American tribes, while there are others who are constantly on the attack. So there are a number of action sequences and things you would expect from any Western that's a cavalry Western, or anything dealing with attacks on homesteads and such. And in terms of the level of violence, there is a bit of description, so it's obviously an adult novel, but it never overdoes it. It feels actually quite realistic. You get a little bit of graphic detail, but nothing extreme ever. You've also got a bit of a love triangle, as our young army officer is engaged to be married to a beautiful society woman who comes out west and can't stand the life at all, but you can see the allure of the West is already starting to take hold in our young officer lead character, who's also quite taken with the beautiful young daughter of the friendly tribal chief, who is committed to peace, and she, of course, was originally part of a wagon train that was slaughtered, and she was the only lone survivor and has been raised in the tribe, and is now the sort of cliched character of the bridge between the two cultures. But all of this is really well done. You've even got tons of detail and characterization about everyone's daily life, what the women of the army fort actually do from day to day, and how even the smallest things add some brightness to their increasingly dreary, very difficult lives. It's quite well done. It could very easily have gone into soap opera territory, but it never does. It's very much pulling from elements of John Ford's classic cavalry trilogy and other films like that, but it's really well done. It's quite effective, and it's a nice standalone book that makes me curious about others in this series. Now I'd like to talk about two books by the same author, one of which is not only the best book that I read this month, but I think it's possibly the best Western that I've yet read, and I do think it is a masterpiece. And that is this collection of two Westerns by the legendary Richard Matheson. Now, Matheson is most famous for his science fiction and horror stories, and the many adaptations that have been made of his works, plus his screenplays. So Matheson is responsible from everything to iconic classic Twilight Zone episodes, to a good number of the Roger Corman Edgar Allan Poe films in the Poe cycle, but also the absolute classic The Comedy of Terrors, and his work was even adapted into Spielberg's first feature, the masterpiece Duel. But it wasn't until more recently that I realized Matheson had written a couple of Western novels and some short stories. The novels came later in his career, and the first major one is contained here, which is Journal of the Gun Years. This came out in 1991, and it did win the Spur Award for Best Western of that year, which was completely deserved because Journal of the Gun Years is the best Western I've read yet. It is a masterpiece. It is also atypical. It's hard to nail down exactly how to describe this book because it is basically drawing on so many elements of Western history and cliches of Westerns and classic elements and mashing them together into a single life story of a notorious figure of the West, a gunslinger who had been a lawman but started life as a young kid who managed to survive the Civil War. And the book strikingly opens with our character as a just physical wreck, a shell of his former self, barely hanging on, just drinking his time away and being challenged by every person who he comes in contact with who thinks that they can be faster than this legendary figure. And he's talking to an old journalist friend who had actually interviewed him years before during his youth and in the Civil War. And the book actually opens with the gunslinger getting killed. And it's the journalist who is stuck having to go through his a little bit of papers, and he discovers that this man had kept a journal all these years. And so the conceit of the book is that you're actually reading the journal of his life story and the gun years. And it's broken up into several books, and each book is a certain number of years. But when you're reading, it is actually done in individual journal entries. Some are long, some are very short. And what's also fun is that the first entry is done exactly as the author in the book, who's acting as editor and occasionally jumps in with some clarification notes in parentheses. But the first entry he includes exactly as Clay Hauser, which is the gunman's name, had written at that time. So it's full of grammatical errors and all this stuff. And then all the other entries are edited by this editor for clarity. But it's a really interesting, fun conceit that the book is self-aware through the additional comments and edits of the editor who is presenting journal entries from these journals. But what's really incredible about this is you get all of the pulp action and fun of a Western, you get all the classic themes of a Western, but you get at the same time, and especially in the final act, the true cost of it all, that what is so glorified in Western fiction and was at the time wasn't exactly how things actually happened. It's, of course, the classic line from The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, when choosing between legend and fact, print the legend. This book is hitting on a lot of the same themes that would be done slightly later in the Unforgiven film, and the book being framed by starting with the death of the character and then basically flashing back to his life story and coming full circle by the end is in a lot of ways, I think, an echoing of the Peckinpah masterpiece Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, with its very unique time structure and storytelling in the original preview versions of that film. So this book has so many different elements. It is a longer book. It's a very meaty book. And you see essentially all the hopes and desires of a character and all the fears and negative aspects of their life slowly start to take over. You see the ups and downs. You experience it along with them. And the writing is so vivid and involving that I devoured this book. I couldn't stop reading it. You get to the end of one journal entry and you've got to read a little bit more. And if you know anything about Westerns, you can start to recognize the parallels he's making. There's basically elements of the real-life Wyatt Earp in Clay Hauser, about how he wound up being a sort of drunken shell of himself, and how he wound up participating in the adaptations of the legends about his life and what that must have done to him. There's references and echoes of famous moments in Westerns, particularly the famous gunfight at the OK Corral has a direct parallel in here. And it makes the book actually richer because it's not just doing its own version of the gunfight at the OK Corral and these other famous moments, but it's echoing them and showing what the real cost actually was and what it would have done to a person who had already been through all this other crap. I think this book is a masterpiece. I think it is absolutely just a staggering achievement, and perfectly fitting that when Matheson decided to just suddenly write a Western novel, he wrote one of the greats, and it is another of his masterpieces. I would put it in that group alongside I Am Legend and The Shrinking Man and some of his other iconic works. It is that good. Again, I devoured this. I read it so quickly I couldn't stop, and the writing just flowed so beautifully. It's also a book you can very easily visualize all the aspects, and it very much puts the reader within the headspace and the realm of the real West, and clashing with the iconography and the storytelling and the mythologizing of the West. So I think this is one of the great Western novels. It's no surprise this won the Spur Award for Best Western that year, and it's the best Western I've read. Now, this edition also includes The Gunfight, which Matheson published in 1993. This is another Western that is a much more direct story. It's basically about a small town where a former famous gunslinger has turned his hand to ranching, and he and his wife have eked out a pretty solid living. But unfortunately for them, one day a beautiful young girl who's engaged to a young man in town happens to spin a tale to basically inflame her beau's jealousies and get him to be a little bit more spirited, if you will. She indirectly talks about her crush on the former Texas Ranger and says that they spent some time together, and this little white lie turns into a giant thing that sweeps through the town, and the former ranger finds basically the entire town turned against him overnight, regardless of him being guilty or not, and everyone, including the boy's family, is pushing this boy to defend his fiance's honor, and that he will need to challenge one of the most notorious gunmen and former Texas Ranger, this legendary figure, to challenge him to a duel and, of course, face certain death. As everyone knows, this kid's going to get killed, but they're pushing him into it anyway. And he is characterized as a very sensitive young man who has never been that type of person. So that's the setup of the book, and everything is building to that final confrontation. They try various things to get around it or to diffuse tensions, but the story is moving to a predetermined point, and so it's really about everyone being swayed by a story that isn't true, and about how quickly everything can fall apart. Again, Matheson is brilliant as a writer, so the story is gripping, the characterizations are great, the details are great, and you get swept up into this quite well. I think it's a marked contrast to how I felt about Guns of the Timberlands, which also had a sort of predetermined final confrontation between hero and villain of the piece. And this book is practically laser focused, and because it's so focused, the tension just ratchets up throughout. I think it is a great book up until the last 5 pages. And that's because the final confrontation does happen at the end, in spite of everybody trying to get around it. And everything happens rather quickly. It feels a little bit forced, and it is one of the conclusions you could have gotten from the story, but for me it did feel like it marred the rest of the book. It was one of those experiences where I get to the end and I'm like, wait, that's it? That's where you went with it? Well, okay, I mean, I guess it works. It does work, but it just it really ruined some of the impact for me and did somewhat tarnish my overall feeling towards the book. I still think The Gunfight is a very good book and a very good read. I would just say to people coming to it to be ready, because the very end is very quick and not necessarily the ending you might have wanted, or I just wish it was a little bit more fleshed out, basically. I think that's why I reacted to it so strongly. But it's still an excellent book, extremely well written, but not as good as Journal of the Gun Years, which really stands out. And then lastly, I'll talk about the big number of adult westerns that I read. Adult westerns is basically the sort of loose genre classification that people use to describe the various action-heavy and also typically sex-heavy series and spin-off series that various publishers did throughout the 1980s and 90s. This is a really fascinating genre because there's some really fantastic works in here, and also most of them were written by an army of ghostwriters. So even among long-running series, which the big ones went for hundreds upon hundreds of volumes and lasted for decades, the quality and style can vary wildly, because you may pick up one book and it's enjoyable, but then the next book, in terms of the numbering, feels completely different because it was a different writer and a different tone. And then some series were geared more towards being more of like a survivalist tale. Some were more violence heavy. Some were even a little bit gory. Some went the opposite way and went extremely heavy on the fun times with the ladies in every town, shall we say. And then some are just flat out ridiculous. But there's a lot of fun to be had for trying a bunch of different ones. And so I found myself kind of getting hooked on these. And they're also, typically rather quick reads. The page counts aren't very long. So that's why I was able to get through so many this month. So to just briefly talk about these, I picked up the 9th and last book in a series from Jove, which was called Bushwhackers. A wonderful title. I had to read it in my movie trailer voice. And so this is the final book entitled Hangman's Drop. You've got some really striking artwork that very much looks almost like a romance novel in terms of its detailing, and the scantily clad woman in a passionate embrace with one of the heroes, I believe. And most of the covers in this series would be variations of this sort of style. And what's notable about this series is that it's not one lead character, but two. You've got the Coulter brothers, who are basically wandering through the West, getting into a series of misadventures after the Civil War, in which they had built up a sort of reputation for themselves. So you've got the requisite mixture of occasional sex scene and bits of violence. The tone was a little bit on the more grim side, so it felt rather realistic, and the plotting was actually pretty good. So I enjoyed this enough that I would actually try another in the series. I also liked that this book had two protagonists, and one of the brothers basically wound up having to wander through the desert, and he gets to a small town where he's immediately confronted by the corrupt sheriff and winds up killing him in a gun duel, and then gets arrested and is going to be executed. So you have to have the other brother waiting for him in another town start to act as a detective and find out what happened to his brother, and then effect a rescue and try to set things right. So there's some nice plotting and layering going on. And again, I found this rather enjoyable, and it was a quick read. Then I tried this book simply because the title and the cover looked too interesting. So this is another Jove Western series. You very quickly have to realize that there were so many series that publishers did, and you just find new ones every time you look in bookstores, ones you've never heard of, because there were so many westerns, because it was basically a giant boom in publishing throughout the 80s and 90s, and something you wouldn't really know about unless you got hooked on them. So I read book 4 in the Diamondback series, entitled Game of Chance. And how can you resist when the lead character is literally called Diamondback? And If you didn't get that connection, they actually put the Diamondback rattlesnake on the book cover to really get that across. The artwork is really nice, and I like how this has a unique design to really make it distinctive. They've even got the rattlesnake on the spine and the rear cover. This was an okay read. I don't know if I'll seek out any others in the series. The lead character is Dex Yancey, who is basically a sort of gambler, gunman, conman, who's basically wandering through the West, trying to amass a fortune. And the backstory that's alluded to is that he was the son of wealthy plantation owners, and due to some various strife and struggles was forced to set out on his own without any money or means of supporting himself. So he's trying to prove himself and build himself back up to, I suppose, go back home one day and try to get even with everyone. It's an okay adult Western. Of course, it literally opens with our lead character and a random prostitute. So it starts with a sex scene, and that's something you get in certain adult Westerns. They didn't waste any time because it was basically publisher mandated that you had to have X number of sex scenes. Some books were more clever about it than others, but that's something that's part and parcel with these. I think the most interesting thing about this book is actually the supporting character of James, who is actually the former slave and companion of Dex. They grew up together because James was purchased by Dex's wealthy parents, and James actually became more than just the playmate and companion. He actually went to the same schools that Dex did, so he is educated, and he's now a freedman who is best friends with our character, who doesn't have any sense of racial prejudice. So it's a really fascinating setup for hero and best friend side character. And I wish this book had done more with that. It's the best thing and most unique aspect of this book in the Diamondback series, and I assume they are the running characters throughout. So that's the only reason why I might check out another book in this series, because I just found that concept really striking and quite refreshing. Then I tried book 7 in the Saddle Tramp series, which was published by HarperCollins. This book came out in 1994, and Saddle Tramp lasted, I think, for somewhere around 10 books. What drew me to this is that not only was it a different publisher, but you've got really striking and lovely wraparound cover artwork that has a very realistic flair, and the fact that there were no scantily clad women on it made me think that this would be one of the adult westerns that was more geared towards gritty naturalism. Well, it certainly is. Our hero is indeed a saddle tramp, wonderfully named Wade Calhoun. He gets swept up into a story that deals with horse thefts that he's tasked with trying to get to the bottom of to get some money to be able to move to the next town. And the suspects are the various Native Americans in the area who've actually built their own small town where they just try to live in peace on their own. And it becomes quite obvious that other factions are actually at play in terms of the horse thefts. What complicates matters, though, is that not only is Wade Calhoun a saddle tramp with all the baggage that carries along with it, but he has a past history of violence and an all-consuming hatred of all Native Americans due to his wife being brutally killed in the past. And so he has to swallow that intense racial prejudice and rage against all Native Americans, regardless of what tribe they are from or what their disposition is. So it makes the lead character multifaceted, not really entirely heroic as a character. He is primarily motivated by self-preservation, but also it's one of those characters where you can get the sense that he still has some degree of morality and still has a conscience, but it has to be dragged out of him. This is a pretty good book as a reading experience. It is rather realistic. When the violence does happen, it is a bit more detailed for sure. It has a very dark tone, one. I do think the plot meanders throughout the second act and the middle of the book, so it does kind of lose focus on what it's doing, but also our hero does get nearly killed and has a long recuperation period, so that does play into it as well. There are a couple sex scenes scattered throughout, but they're very minor. They're not super graphic or anything, but I will say nothing will prepare you for the end of this book. The end of this book pours on the action, the body count goes up, the actual descriptions of the violence is a little bit more, so you get some graphic details about the violence, and then after several notable plot twists and character deaths at the end, our hero manages to get the final villain and, bring his shot up, bruised, battered self back to the office of the official that had hired him in the first place and didn't like the work Calhoun was doing, and previously in the book actually tries to have him arrested and accuses him of being one of the horse thieves. So basically, Calhoun's life is not an easy one, and everybody winds up hating or not liking him for the most part, simply because he exists. But what happens with the final villain in this and how it's done? I mean, it doesn't go into extremely graphic details, but it is jaw-dropping what Calhoun does and the vengeance he extracts. And the fact that he does this in front of witnesses in an office, and the witnesses, including the town officials, are so shocked that they are described as literally vomiting where they stand. If you want a book that's an adult Western that you could say has moments that go full hardcore, well, the end of Saddle Tramp Book 7 is hardcore. And if you're really curious what I'm talking about, the end of Horse Thieves Trail, let me just say it involves essentially torturing the villain to death with a knife. It's jaw-droppingly dark. Now to turn to some of the long-running adult westerns, I read a double edition reprint of 2 more books in the Buckskin series. So these are more of what you typically would expect from an adult western. You've got these very striking covers that promise all sorts of action and, of course, lots of sex, which is going to be peppered throughout as the hero will typically get into bed with just about every female character in the book most of the time. The Buckskin series started out, though, as a completely different character, so these are 2 later books. It's actually the son of the original Buckskin. From what I've heard, the earlier books are a lot more cringy in terms of what the supposed hero actually does, and also feature violence against women and other sorts of things that you ran into more in the adult westerns earlier on in the late 70s, early 80s. But from the ones I've read in this series, they're all these later ones with the son of the character, and if you could say that they're softer than how the series started, that's how I would describe it from what I've heard about those earlier books. So the hero character here is Lee Morgan, who's a famous gunslinger who basically gets into all sorts of shenanigans in each book, and while there's supposedly a little bit of loose continuity and mentions of his father and events that happened in other books, you basically have to look at each of these as standalones. The plotting in these is not good. They kind of meander, and they live or die on the strengths of the fun of the action set pieces and also the fun of the characters. And the other double that I read of 2 books, I think, was relatively fun, and I read that when I first started getting into these. These 2, it's kind of more of the same, but I don't think they're as good. The author of the Buckskins was apparently Chet Cunningham, who was very prolific and usually wrote under a pseudonym. His westerns that I've read, and these are no exception, very much focus on just piling on the action and the plot twists, and especially the sex scenes. So you have tons of sex scenes in these books, and it's sometimes in detriment to the plot that's being told. The first book is called Remington Ridge, and it's sees Lee Morgan coming back to the ranch he left because apparently in the previous book he just randomly decided to go off and go on an expedition to South America that didn't go well, and he left his ranch even though it's been threatened by various villains who have actually taken it over during his absence, and also they may be the villains responsible for killing his wife in the past, and he just said, well, I'm not going to kill you, maybe later. Well, now he's got to deal with that. It's rather striking because he also shows up at the start and he's writing to his ranch with a beautiful prostitute that he picked up who wanted to see the West and is kind of in over her head. And so the book starts with them literally just going at it because these books have to have a sex scene in like the first chapter or two. And then she gets killed 5 seconds later, so I don't know why this character's here. Do not question the plots of these in the Buckskin series, because if you do, you're going to drive yourself nuts. As a book, it's an okay experience. It's also frequently nonsensical. Lee Morgan does this with the prostitute that he's bringing back to his house, where also in town is the woman he's attached to and had a long relationship with, who he just wandered off and left, who he's also probably going to marry. So he's anticipating it not going well because he's brought a new lady friend with him, but then she gets killed, so everything's perfectly fine. That's, again, just at the start of this. There's a lot of action, there's a lot of Western cliches, there's a number of sex scenes, and it's an okay read, I guess, but I had to really focus to actually get through this. The second book is Shotgun Station, and this one was a real challenge because it's the very next book in the series, but yet it has nothing to do with the previous book, so I guess Morgan didn't get married to the woman he was going to marry, and there's no mention made really of his ranch that he killed so many men to take back over, so it's like the last book never really happened, but this book sees him being tasked to help a stage line that's under siege, and somehow it's tied to the Mexican Revolution, and so he's not just dealing with a wealthy Mexican businessman then, but he also winds up dealing with Pancho Villa and his revolutionary forces, and also there's the most powerful ranch in the area who has something against the stage line owner, and of course the main operator of the stage line and the ranch owner are feisty, beautiful women who both wind up sleeping with the hero. But this book is baffling. It is a bit of a slog to get through. Yes, it's got action and sex scenes, but nothing makes any sense. And there are so many plot twists in this book that you can't even keep anything straight. In fact, in the last chapter or two, I'd say there's another 10 or 15 plot twists, and some of them come out of nowhere. So it's kind of entertaining just from the sheer what the heck am I reading factor. But it was not a good book, and there are way too many plot twists here, and this book doesn't make a lick of sense, really. I then decided to finally try the long-running legendary Longarm series. This is one of the big four in terms of the 4 main series of adult westerns that lasted for hundreds of volumes and for decades. Like I said before, most of these books were written by an army of ghostwriters, and they vary in quality wildly. With Longarm, it's focusing around the character of lawman Custis Long, and because it's an adult western, you very quickly understand exactly what is long in these books. So it doesn't leave anything to the imagination because these books are peppered with sex scenes, as virtually everyone in adult westerns is unbelievably nonstop horny, and everywhere there's beautiful women who are just going to hop into bed with this cigar chomping lawman gunslinger who's got a twinkle in the eye and is able to somehow overcome every adversary. But it very much depends on which book you're reading in terms of the effectiveness, and the series was so long running that it went for not just hundreds of volumes, but for multiple decades. So it ran from the 80s all the way up into the 2000s. So the first one I actually have read is book 315 in the series, which is Longarm and the Lost Patrol.
Longarm answers the call of duty from Uncle Sam.
So the covers usually feature Longarm in the dead center with hat and cigar firmly in mouth and almost a sort of raised eyebrow looking at the cover. But of course, you also have to think he's looking at the scantily clad women who are going to be on the cover. So this has an art mixture that's also, I think, using some photographs. But this is the basic sort of template you get from all of these. The house name is Tabor Evans, but again, it's going to be a ghostwriter. So here you get the rear blurb. And even though this looks like a regular Longarm and it doesn't look like a book that was published in the 2000s, this is from 2005. The long-running series kept going even after the boom had ended. So this story finds Marshal Long tasked with finding out what happened to a missing cavalry patrol and also how that might tie into other goings-on. There's also a feisty, beautiful young woman introduced early in the story, and you have to wonder how she and Longarm will eventually find themselves in bed together. Also, other beautiful women scattered throughout the story. But this, I thought, was actually pretty entertaining. It builds to a really action-packed conclusion, which involves lots of dynamite and a significant body count, so that was really entertaining. And I think this is a solid action-packed quick read that will give you the overall flavor of what the Longarm series is like. And it's also great because it doesn't overdo the sex scenes, which is always a danger with adult westerns. The plotting is solid and the pacing is good, so I think it reads quite well. And I would say this is a good book to try if you're curious about the Longarm series. The same cannot be said about Longarm 270.
Longarm and the Lady Bandit.
I read this and another Longarm because my library actually had some as ebooks for digital checkout. This is, of course, an earlier book in the series, but it still has the same conceit of Marshal Long finding his way into a particular case and winding up sleeping with every beautiful woman around. But this book is easily the worst book that I read this month. It is terrible. It is a slog. I had to force myself to finish it, even though it's not a particularly very long book. It's basically about a beautiful young woman who comes to the marshal trying to get help because her brother has been arrested as a horse thief and is probably going to be executed, but she claims he only did it as a sort of drunken prank. But she may have ulterior motives, and things get complicated further when things aren't necessarily adding up. And there's also a gang running around carrying out various raids that may or may not be led by a mysterious woman. This is a book that's so bad you just don't care about anything. The plot is not consistent and confusing, and the book just keeps going. It doesn't read well, it's not engaging, and you can sort of figure out who the actual villain is and what the plot reveal is going to be in like the first couple chapters, and when that finally gets revealed, it's on the last couple pages of the book, and by that point you've forgotten about what was going on because you just want it to be over. This book is so boring and dull and unengaging, so you just read through event after event that are just mixed in with Longarm sleeping with every woman around, except he doesn't sleep with the mysterious woman who gets the story started because he feels something is kind of off and weird, and you're sitting there with this book and you're like, yeah, no duh. Can we get this over, please? So I would not recommend this book to anyone. It is terrible. I only finished it because I try to finish every book that I start, but this was just terrible. It was bad, and I think this shows the great range that you can get with the Longarm series in terms of each book's effectiveness is greatly dependent on like what era of the series it came in, and most of all who wrote it, because I've now read 3 Longarms and 2 were rather good, and this one was atrociously bad. So then after that experience, I decided to try one more because I guess I'm a glutton for punishment, and this was Longarm 285.
Longarm and the Mysterious Mistress!
And actually, this was an enjoyable read, so it made up for the atrociously bad Longarm 270. This has a rather striking opening. Longarm is in Colorado. He's having a nice romantic night stroll with the current woman of his interest when he dives into the river to save a boy who's being drawn into the icy rapids. In doing so, he not only gets injured and almost dies, but he risks catching pneumonia. So as part of his recuperation, he's sent to Arizona, where of course he runs into trouble. There's a wealthy landowner who has, of course, a beautiful young daughter, but the older man winds up getting killed. He's actually poisoned, and so there's some nefarious people out there trying to obtain control of the ranch, but also in the town there's a corrupt marshal who kills a man in cold blood in front of Longarm. So there's multiple plot threads that all come together quite nicely, and you've got our hero actually having to recuperate during this process, so he's in a weakened physical state. I thought this was an enjoyable read. It held my interest throughout. It was really well paced, and I would say it's probably the best of the 3 Longarms I've read so far. And so now that I've had a good experience with 2 of them, I will continue to read sporadic books in the series, but I'm just hoping they're all better than book 270, which was awful. Now, with each of the big main series, the publishers would sometimes try to have various spin-offs. So for Longarm, they tried an interesting concept that unfortunately for me doesn't really work in the execution, and that is the
Lone Star
series, where you have a female gunslinger protagonist, Jessica Starbuck, who is referred to as Lone Star, and then her companion, Kai, or Key, I'm not sure how you're supposed to pronounce it, who is a martial arts expert also who throws throwing stars instead of typically using firearms. So they wander through the West, and they're bounty hunters or righting wrongs and different things, and of course, they both wind up having sex, especially Jessica, who's described as impossibly beautiful, and there's several times where she just hooks up with the dude throughout the entire book, and the plot stops to describe their lovemaking for a while. The concept of having a male-female team going through the West, and one being a martial arts expert and the other being a beautiful female gunslinger, it's a good pulpy concept, and there's also a backstory of Jessica Starbuck doing this because her father was killed by what's essentially a crime syndicate that runs through various parts of the West, and so she's always trying to vindicate her father and bring all of his killers to justice. It's a wonderful pulp fiction concept, and it sounds like it should work beautifully, even with the conceit that it's still an adult Western and you've got to have the sex scenes crammed in. So I finally tried one of these. This is book 43. They did actually quite a number of these. You can definitely tell it's a spinoff of Longarm in terms of the cover design, having 2 floating heads instead of 1 now, and a very similar aesthetic. Of course, you've got the central pose right off a romance novel cover, and then you've got a similar logo, but now having a throwing star with a yin and yang symbol in it. So the overall packaging, design, spine, artwork, everything is otherwise identical to the Longarm books. So this book came out in 1986, and it finds Jessica and Kai dealing with shenanigans going on around a lumber mining site. It's a good enough setup. The plot works, but this book meanders terribly. It's hard to focus on the plot and actually maintain your interest. Despite the wonderful pulpy concept, this book is frequently quite boring and at some points nonsensical and a bit frustrating. It also has the problem of some of the sex scenes are rather amusingly shoved in or just completely wacky in why they happen. The one that I found hilarious here is that our characters meet basically a sort of grizzled prospector and the beautiful girl who's traveling along with him. And later on, there's a sequence where they were trying to get on board a raft and go down the river or go across, but the people operating the raft were actually in league with the villains, and so there's a shootout, and then the raft flies off and is out of control, and they're approaching rapids, but the girl gets knocked off, so Kai dives in after her, and they barely manage to make it back to the riverbank and not get killed in the raging waters, while Jessica and the old man are being swept away on the raft. So what does our hero do once he's got this beautiful girl rescued and they're both soaked to the bone, and his best friend in the world and another man are about to be killed? of course, they stop and rip each other's clothes off and just go at it there behind a rock while their friends and family are dying. So, and then they very quickly finish up, and it's revealed that the young woman is apparently, I mean, it's not said she's a nymphomaniac, but she's very much turned on by all men, apparently, and then our hero of the book decides, oh yeah, maybe I should go try and save everyone now. Aw, dang it, we shouldn't have done that, but it was great anyway. That's the sort of mentality that happens. I just loved how completely ridiculous that was. And that's really about all I remember from this book, because it was otherwise a slog to get through and unfortunately waste the premise. So, of course, me being new to adult westerns and also being a glutton for punishment, what did I do? I read another one. So this is book 121, which was released in 1992.
Lone Star and the Gunrunners. A range war is brewing, and it's about to boil over.
This is more of the same, but thankfully it's a lot better. It's not perfect, though, and it has all the same problems. So the plot meanders like crazy. It finds Jessica and Kai on the trail of two ne'er-do-wells who have actually stolen some guns from the army, killed a lot of people in doing it, and have been selling the guns to various Native American tribes on the warpath. So you've got the sort of Western cliches of various criminals and villains and scalawags basically being gun runners, but they're selling off, not great weaponry and trying to cut and run with as much profit as they can. And others catch wind of this, so there's multiple people on their trail. There's some entertainment to this plot. Some bits work and some of the characterizations work, but then the plot meanders like crazy and it takes forever to get to the predetermined end, and the end itself feels like an afterthought. So it's a bit better than book 43, but it's not really good. And so unfortunately, I don't think any book in this series really hits its full potential. But, if I find another one, I might try it, because why not? And of course, the cover does come in the same format and style, promising more of the same. And you've got the inherent kind of humor of Kai basically saying, yeah, I've just punched you to death with my hand, on top of Jessica and Dude vacationing from the cover of a romance novel. Then I read another of the big four of adult westerns, which is the Trailsman series. This lasted for hundreds of volumes and for several decades, and after the original author was no longer writing, I think he wrote, or is said to have written, most of the first 200 books in the series, it then became an army of ghostwriters. So I read book 194, which is
Montana Stage. Sky Fargo makes money-hungry murderers bite the bullet.
All of these books are credited to the house name of John Sharp, and most of them, like this, have a really nice aesthetic of the artwork going for a hand-painted quality. So you've got the Stagecoach action, which is the plot of this book, and I really love the tranquil but also slightly sensual look of the top, featuring Sky Fargo, who's our hero, the trailsman of the title, and a beautiful young woman on horseback overlooking a river, but then also you see the beautiful young woman and one stocking looking rather provocative. It's a really nice cover, and I think this is actually a quite enjoyable book. Sky Fargo as a hero is not obviously a federal marshal like Longarm, so he's acting out of his own interest, primarily due to self-preservation and trying to rub two bits together to get some money in his wallet. But he has a code of honor, he has a code of conduct, and he also loves the ladies, because you have to have the requisite number of sex scenes. But again, those are nicely written in here, they're not too graphic, and the plot stays on track with a good deal of plot focus. Sky Fargo is tasked with helping a stagecoach line that's being attacked and robbed, and no one can figure out exactly how or why this is being done continually, but it threatens to ruin the stage line. Over the course of the story, it becomes apparent that all is not what it seems, and there are a number of really nice double crosses, and of course, several female characters who wind up having their way with Sky Fargo, and it builds to a really satisfying action-packed climax. This is the first Trailsman that I've read, and it really makes me want to check out more in the series. It was so good that I think this is definitely one of the best adult westerns I've yet read. Here is the spine, and as you can see, this was published by Signet. So the Trailsman was really Signet's entry and long-running contestant in the adult western market. Then I returned to the long-running Slocum series. This is another of the big four. It started actually in the late 70s, and the early books were all published by Playboy. And if that concept seems bizarre, it's true. Playboy actually had a whole series of adult Western paperbacks focusing on John Slocum, who was a Civil War veteran and basically wandered through the West into a series of misadventures with lots of gunplay and, of course, constant sex. Eventually, the rights would get purchased, and so the series was taken over by Jove, who published under different imprints, and the whole tonality of the series changed with that. They became much more of the adult Western standard, as the Playboy books, at least from the one I've read, they definitely have a sleazy vibe to them. They are much more in line with the books that started the adult Western trend in the late 70s, early 80s, the ones like Edge that were a lot more graphic and nasty and darker tinged, and the female characters were not all that well defined. And in the early Playboy Slocum that I tried, it basically was a character who was not very likable and kind of survived only due to plain sheer dumb luck, and he just blundered his way through the whole story, and also had lots of random sex because, of course, what would you expect in a Playboy Western novel? So it's really when the books go to the other publisher that I think they really become the series that they should have always been. So I decided to try some more under Berkeley Jove. So the earliest one I have was book 95,
Rawhide Justice!
And this has a singular cover design with nice painted artwork. And as you can see, they are focusing more on the Jake Logan name, which is the house name. All the books were ghost written by a variety of writers, so there is no Jake Logan. And it's also funny that the major publisher was trying to downplay the Slocum name and branding because Slocum is, very obviously, if you want to look at it because it's an adult Western and you want to scrutinize that name closely, it's kind of just like a sleazy, bad sex joke. That's not even funny, but yeah, it's rather amusing that the major publisher immediately changed the focus to the house name as if that was the title of the series. This finds Slocum in and around Dodge City, and it is a significant improvement over the Playboy book that I read in the series, Bloody Trail to Texas. This has a much better depiction of women, and of course has the requisite number of sex scenes scattered throughout, but the writing quality is overall rather good. By this point, they were getting a lot of really good authors who specialized in westerns and men's adventure stories in terms of paperbacks to do the ghost-written Slocum books and other adult westerns. The only issue I have with this book is that it does meander a little bit in its plot, and Slocum is also a bit reactionary throughout a good chunk of it. There's also a little bit of a nastier tinge here and there in terms of the tone. It's very minor, and it's nothing compared to the earlier one that I read. But I think this was a solid improvement over that, and it made me want to try another one. So I tried the next one that I had, which is book 99, wonderfully titled
Sixgun Cemetery!
Again, you've got really nice painted artwork, which is depicting elements from the story, the same matching design, the rear cover, and this was released originally in 1987. This is an improvement even over book 95. This is a truly satisfying read. It finds Slocum being asked by an old friend to come out to his ranch house, which is under siege. He's got a small setup and, of course, a beautiful, feisty young daughter who immediately sets her eyes on this dashing gunslinger man of the West. And they're all having to fend off the massive forces of the biggest rancher in town, who also has the various town officials and law in his pocket. And he's determined to take over this small ranch because he wants to own every bit of land and control everything, to be the cattle baron of the area. He has all of the resources in his pocket, so it's up to Slocum to try and figure out how to defend this small ranch with only, basically himself, his old friend, the one foreman, and the beautiful young daughter. So it's just 4 of them against, like 30 or more guys who are armed to the teeth. And this book is really good. It builds to a fantastic climax that is actually believable, where you have 4 people trying to hold out against, 30 or more. It's got tons of action. It's got great set pieces. It's got great characterization. The writing is fantastic. And even the requisite sex scenes are handled with a level of delicacy, because you do have the lead character having relations with the daughter of his best friend, which of course has a lot of negative connotations that goes along with it. But it's something that the daughter actually instigates herself. She is of age. She is very feisty and opinionated and endearing to the reader in her own right. And Slocum actually does try to, in his own way, set her on a right path and encourage her to find someone more appropriate. So it's handled with actually a degree of grace, and all the characters are believable and well written, far more than what I expected for something that was just a simple adult Western. So this was a fantastic read. I would say anyone would enjoy this, and it's one of the best books that I read this month. If you needed a further inducement than 4 people holding off an entire army of hired killers, this book also introduces the feisty female heroine, because she single-handedly defends her father's ranch against 2 gunslingers who wandered up by shooting at them, and shooting one of them in the ass, and then proudly admitting it when Slocum and her father ride up, and she jumps up, and she's got a smudge of gunpowder on one cheek, and basically says, "Oh, I shot him in the ass. He's not going to sit down anytime soon." So that immediately was where I was like, okay, yes, I love this book already. So that one was so good and so enjoyable that immediately I had to read another one. So the next one I have is book 101,
Hell's Fury.
Again, really lovely, bold, painted artwork. This one having a nice dusky yellow-orange, promising action, and of course, lovemaking, and proudly featuring Jake Logan with no sign of Slocum except for here in the blurb. Have the same spine, same rear cover. This book was even better. I would say this is actually the 3rd best book that I read this June. This is a fantastically well-written book. The actual sex scenes, while there are some because you can't get away from them, there's not very many of them. It was quite surprising and refreshing how little that was a factor in this book. And the ones that do happen, most of them are basically off screen. They basically have the build up, and then it's like there's a fade out as the paragraphs change, and then it picks up sometime later. So it's like in a classic film when you have the fade to black when they go to bed, and then it picks up the next morning, which was shocking for a Slocum book. I didn't think any of them would do something like that. But this opens quite strikingly as Slocum's in a saloon. He's with a young guy he befriended on the trail who seems like a upstanding, nice young guy, and then these men, obviously killers, come in. They are looking for the person of this name, and then they gun down the young man in cold blood, essentially. And as they get away, Slocum manages to kill one of them, and he's so moved by what he's just witnessed that he's deciding to set off after them. But he's then asked by the beautiful mother of the dead boy, who is herself a widow, to find the men who did this, but not to kill them, to actually find out why they killed her son. And so Slocum agrees, and he refuses to take any money. So the main plot of the book is trying to run down the killers, who are run by a vicious bandit known only as Redpole. But it quickly becomes much more than that, as over the course of the chase, he is drawn into another plot, which is actually part of the original plot. He finds he starts to find the reasons why. Redpoll is actually the foreman of a ranch, which is run by a seemingly well-natured man who actually ordered the death of this young boy for reasons we don't know, and of course has a beautiful young daughter who sets her eyes on Slocum once he appears. So you've got multiple different plot threads running, and a nice sense of plot progression. Everything actually comes together quite beautifully in ways that you wouldn't necessarily expect, but by the end of the book, all the puzzle pieces fit together nicely. It's a satisfying read. I would say my only complaint is that the ending, because these books are usually a set page length, the ending is maybe just a tad rushed because there are several plot twists that come right at the end. But it's still satisfying. It's still good. And this is the best Slocum that I've read so far, and one of the best adult Westerns I've read so far. In fact, it's just a good Western novel that I've read. I'd say it rises above the adult Western classification that's usually used as a derogatory one for these types of books. But this is really, really good, and it's the third best book that I read this month. And then last, I want to talk about the second best Western that I read this month, which is part of the fourth and final big name series of adult Westerns, and that is the Gunsmith series by J.R. Roberts, who is in fact Robert Randisi. And what's unique about the Gunsmith series is this series lasted for decades, basically until the author's death not too long ago, and all of them, including the spin-offs and the giant books, which are basically double-length, larger books, were written by Robert Randisi. So there were no ghostwriters with the Gunsmith, and every single one of these that I have read is great. Not just fun and holds your attention and is well written enough to be a good, adult Western. No, every one that I've read is actually great. You still have to understand that these have all the aspects of the form. They do have the requisite sex scenes. They do have, typically a certain length. So sometimes the endings can be maybe a little bit rushed because there's simply a limitation. But I don't know how Randisi did it. The writing quality of these is far above what you would expect from an adult Western series. I've now read about 5 or 10, and every single one of them has been the same excellent quality level of writing. The characters, the side characters, the world building, the plotting, the storytelling, everything. You pick up a Gunsmith book, you know you're going to enjoy the experience, and you will get hooked into the plot, so you don't set it down until you've finished it. And they're short enough and so engaging that you want to finish it. You don't want to put the book down. And the writing quality never once dips in terms of sacrificing anything because it's an adult Western. And somehow Randisi was able to keep the same level of consistency while writing, a book a month or a book every 2 months or whatever the schedule was. And to do this for decades, because the Gunsmith started in the 80s and lasted until the author's death in the 2020s. And if you count up all of the books together and the spinoffs and the giants, it's over 500 books, all written by the same author, who was also writing tons of other books under his own name and pseudonyms, and even other Westerns. I don't know how he did it. He's one of the most unbelievably prolific authors I've ever encountered, and he's become one of my favorite authors simply on the strength of his Gunsmiths that I've read alone, because these books are that good. So the Gunsmith is about Clint Adams, who is a character who once served as a deputy marshal and has gone through the West and built up a reputation as a famous gunslinger, an expert gambler, and of course, an expert at wooing the ladies, except Clint Adams actually likes women and doesn't treat them as mere objects to pass the time with or to pleasure himself. So while these books have the requisite sex scenes and they do get into a bit of detail, as all adult Westerns do, Clint Adams as a character is a heroic character. He's best described as a mixture of Clint Eastwood's typical personas, of course, why he's named Clint, but also, I would say, bits of Maverick. There's also a dash of James Bond, especially with each book having a different primary love interest and also secondary love interest. But there's also even a tinge of classical Western heroes and tropes. So there's basically something in these books for everyone, and all of them are ridiculously enjoyable. So this is volume 132, The Great Riverboat Race, which was published in 1992. This is the standard style of most of the books that were published by Jove. So you've got the white covers, you've got the striking Gunsmith logo, and you've got the central image of Clint Adams there with the scar on his cheek, which again is a slight connection to the literary James Bond and his facial scar. And then the books would always feature depictions of elements from the book. So this book is set on the Mississippi gambling riverboats, which is a beautiful, perfect Western setting. So we've got two riverboats, as the book does build to a riverboat race at the end. And you've got a depiction of gambling, and of course the passionate embrace, which looks like it's right off of a romance novel. The spines had uniform matching designs on all gunsmiths, and you've got a very similar rear cover. And you can tell this is the same publisher as the Longarm series, but there's a little bit of distinction that makes it specifically a Gunsmith paperback. The plot of this book is rather straightforward. Clint Adams is visiting a gambling riverboat. He's friends with the owner, and the owner's having various troubles with his boat being sabotaged. There's a rival riverboat owner who's obviously somehow tied into or possibly behind the sabotage, as he wants to take over operations on all the Mississippi. There's, of course, a beautiful red-haired casino dealer on the riverboat who is fascinated by the gunsmith. There's also another beautiful woman who herself is a fantastic gambler and is in the high-stakes poker games that run into the night on the riverboat. And so the gunsmith finds himself trying to help a friend and get to the bottom of what actually becomes basically a sort of murder mystery on a riverboat, and the corpses keep appearing. Plus, there's a sneak thief on board, and people keep losing their belongings, and there's increasing acts of sabotage. And if all of this didn't sound promising enough, there's also a special guest appearance by a famous historical character, because on the riverboat, keeping to himself, is one Samuel Clemens. So the gunsmith actually gets to encounter Mark Twain, and the character of Mark Twain is beautifully woven into the book. It doesn't feel ham-fisted that suddenly there's a famous historical figure in here, and Clemens as Mark Twain is basically cajoled into writing about the riverboat and then eventually the big riverboat race that's going to happen between the two riverboats and the two factions, and whoever wins will basically take the whole operations of the Mississippi. This book is so much fun. It's so well written, and yes, it's got the sex scenes, but they're never overdone. And what's really striking about sex scenes in the Gunsmith series is that there's characterization that is there for the female characters, even if they're just side characters, and every sex scene actually enhances or adds something to the characters. The characters actually are different and have advanced after the sex scene has occurred, so they actually serve a purpose, and they manage then to overcome the handicaps of, okay, it's an adult Western, you got to have a sex scene every 3 to 4 chapters or the publisher's going to start raising Cain. But in terms of this book, it's another excellent Gunsmith. I think the plot twists that come up, especially the final ones in the last act, are really good. They're not exactly the ones you expect, and they are well deserved. The only issue I had with this, and something that I already alluded to, which you run into with a lot of these adult Westerns, is because they're usually about 180 pages like this is, sometimes the endings are a little bit fast or a little bit abrupt. Here, it's not a problem, except for one factor, and that's because this book is called The Great Riverboat Race. It builds to a great riverboat race between factions. You've got all the setup, you've got everything there, but the book actually ends before the race takes place. The story ends where it definitely should in terms of where the characters are at, but it does leave you kind of hanging a bit because you don't actually get to witness the race between the two riverboats. But in all honesty, that probably would have required a whole other book to describe the ins and outs of the race and probably the acts of sabotage that would continue, but everything is otherwise wrapped up here. So that is everything that I read for June on the Range in 2026. It was a lot more than I actually thought I was going to get to, and part of that is because the adult westerns and paperbacks that I read are generally a certain length, and when they're really good, they read very fast. And even when they're okay, they still read pretty fast. But there were some, like Longarm 270, I had to keep taking breaks. I didn't know if I was actually going to finish that. And to be honest, I actually stopped reading that book more than once and wound up reading a completely other Western and then coming back to it and having the same problem and stopping after another chapter or two and then reading a whole other book and coming back. I wouldn't recommend that because if you read a lot of adult Westerns or Western series books or any books like this and you read a lot of them in a month like I just did, you kind of get into Western overload, and you can also start to mix up events and plots and characters of different books because they're all kind of variations on a theme. But if you spread them out or you read a bunch like I did for June on the Range, it's really fun. You just dive into the expanded world of Western fiction. So I tried to read a little bit of everything, but also I'm finding myself more and more fascinated by adult Westerns because they're heavy on the pulp action and usually they move with a really good pace in terms of the plotting. And it's also kind of funny because some of them go way overboard on the sex scenes. So those can be amusing for those reasons and also some of the conceits of the genre. But it's just another fascinating part of reading Westerns, and I'm trying to get more reading experience reading more Westerns, as I haven't really read all that many up until the past couple years. So I just wanted to talk about everything I read this month for June on the Range, at least in some detail. I did enjoy most everything that I read. Some things I might try again later, like the Lamore book, I might reread later on and enjoy it a bit more after I've read some of his other works. But the absolute highlight was Matheson's Journal of the Gun Years. That book is a masterpiece, I think. And right up there were the really excellent Gunsmith and Slocum books that I read, and I'd also put the Trailsman up there as well. I'm definitely going to continue with those series, and I am determined to read every Gunsmith because they're all great, at least from what I've read so far. So as always, I hope my babblings about books and book collecting and diving into the wild world of Western books has been at least somewhat fun and informative. This is my own contribution to June on the Range, and I encourage people to check out other wonderful booktube channels and see what they've gotten up to out on the range for 2026, and to also maybe think about trying some Westerns for yourself or participating next year in June on the Range for 2027. Hopefully this has highlighted some books you might be interested in or some series you might like to try. I would encourage people, if you're interested, to try some of the wonderfully fun adult Western series. They're very plentiful and cheap on the used market, but you have to find copies in good condition, and you really just have to try some to get a feel for what they're like and see if you like any of them. But I think the real highlight, though, was Journal of the Gun Years, which gets my highest recommendation. I think that book was sensational, and that book alone was worth the whole experience of trying just a giant stack of Western paperbacks this month. So as always, please do keep supporting your local independent bookstores by hopefully being able to find some lovely Westerns to add to your collection or some Westerns to try out. Keep enjoying the wonders of booktube and various booktube reading events. Keep reading, and thank you ever so much for watching.